An Amish man paid for a pregnant widow to cook for him, but what he got was far more than supper on the table. On the edge of the Colorado wilderness, a lonely homesteader opens his door expecting a cook, and instead finds a young widow with nothing but a carpetbag, a Bible, and a child soon to be born. He offers her shelter, but the church bell tolls. Dust rises as a stern preacher rides in, demanding she be dragged back for judgment. Whispers follow her everywhere. Lamplight flickers in the cabin as she kneads bread with trembling hands. And yet her songs, her kindness, her unshakable faith begin to stir something in the man's heart he thought long dead. But the storm outside grows darker. A baby comes too soon. A preacher returns with threats, and the line between law and mercy is about to break. What happens when a man bound by tradition meets a woman who shows him grace stronger than shame? And when the snow clears, will they stand together as a family, or be torn apart by the world's judgment? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Autumn wind whistled through the gaps in Russell Yoder's cabin walls as he arranged 3 tin plates on the rough-hewn table. His large hands, calloused from years of working the Colorado soil, moved with careful precision. The plates made hollow sounds against the wood, echoing in the quiet space. He stepped back, studying his work. The cabin wasn't much, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace, but he'd spent the afternoon sweeping every corner and laying fresh straw in the small side room where the cook would sleep. The agent in town had promised him someone experienced, someone who could bring order to his bachelor's home without disrupting his plain way of life. The clip-clop of hooves drew his attention. Through the window, Russell watched a wagon approach in the gathering dusk, its wheels cutting fresh tracks in the dusty road. His heart quickened, not from excitement, but from the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The wagon stopped. Instead of the gray-haired widow he'd pictured, a young woman carefully descended, one hand pressed against her swollen middle. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Her dark blue dress was clean but worn, and she clutched a carpetbag in one hand and a Bible in the other. The sight of her condition made Russell's throat tighten. "Evening," the wagon driver called down from his perch. "Got your housekeeper here, Mr. Yoder, named Sarah Leland." He clicked his tongue, already turning the team around. "Just the delivery." "Man, you understand. Good day to you both." Before Russell could object, the wagon was moving away, leaving him alone with the young woman. She stood still as a startled deer, her eyes downcast. "I'm Sarah," she said softly. "The placement agent sent me." Her voice trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin, showing a quiet dignity that caught Russell off guard. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the yard. Night was coming fast, and with it, the bitter cold of a Colorado autumn. Russell's mind raced. This wasn't what he'd paid for, wasn't what he'd expected at all. But he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way she swayed slightly on her feet. "Come in," he found himself saying, stepping aside to let her pass. "The night air's getting sharp." Sarah entered, her carpetbag clutched tight against her chest. The lamplight caught the gold of her hair, neatly tucked under a plain bonnet. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the iron cook stove, the stack of firewood, the wooden chairs, the row of hooks where his black coat hung. "I can cook," she said quickly, as if sensing his doubts. "I'm strong enough for the work, Mr. Yoder. I won't be a burden." Russell watched as she set her bag down and moved to the stove with surprising efficiency. She found the cornmeal and cooking pots without having to ask, her movements sure despite her condition. Soon, the cabin filled with the sounds of cooking. The crack of an egg, the scrape of a spoon against iron, the soft pat-pat of cornbread batter being smoothed in a pan, the familiar sense of home. Cooking began to fill the air, something Russell hadn't experienced since his wife's passing 3 years ago. He sat at the table, his hands folded, watching as Sarah worked. She hummed softly, a hymn he recognized from Sunday meetings, while she stirred a pot of stew she'd quickly assembled from the vegetables and meat he'd laid out. "Supper will be ready soon," she said, her voice steadier now. She moved between stove and table, setting out spoons, her presence already changing the feel of the cabin. Where there had been emptiness, there was now movement and purpose. Russell felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was known in the community as an upright man, someone who followed the old ways without question. Having a young, pregnant widow under his roof would raise eyebrows, create talk. Yet the thought of sending her away, of making her face the gathering dark alone, went against everything he believed about Christian charity. As Sarah placed a steaming bowl of stew before him, the aroma of sage and beef rising in the lamplight, Russell made his decision. Whatever complications this might bring, he would trust that the Lord had a purpose in sending Sarah Leland to his door. For tonight at least, she would have shelter. The cornbread came out golden brown, filling the cabin with its warm, homey smell. Sarah served it without ceremony, then took her own seat across the table. Her eyes met his briefly before bowing her head for grace. In that moment, Russell saw not just her vulnerability, but also a determination that spoke of deep strength. Lamplight cast dancing shadows across the wooden table as Russell and Sarah sat facing each other. The only sounds were the gentle crackle of the fire and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. The silence stretched between them like a drawn thread, neither knowing quite how to break it. Sarah's hands folded in her lap, then rose to adjust her bonnet before settling on the table's edge. "Shall I say grace?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Russell nodded, bowing his head. Her prayer came soft but clear, thanking the Lord for shelter and sustenance. The simple words carried a weight of gratitude that made his throat tighten. As they ate, Russell couldn't help but notice how Sarah handled the utensils with practiced grace, her movements showing years of careful training. Yet her eyes remained downcast, as if bearing an invisible burden. The stew was the best he'd tasted since his wife's passing, but he found himself watching Sarah more than his food. When the bowls were nearly empty, Sarah set down her spoon. "Mr. Yoder," she began, her fingers twisting in her apron, "I reckon you deserve to know about my situation." She drew a deep breath. "My husband, Thomas Leland, was a drifter. He had big dreams but no roots. We married young, against my folks' wishes. He died sudden like 3 months ago. Fever took him while we were traveling." Her voice wavered but held steady. "The townsfolk, they call me reckless. Say I brought shame on myself, running off with a man who couldn't provide." She touched her swollen middle briefly. "But I mean to work hard, Mr. Yoder. I can earn my keep." Russell listened without comment, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. Yet inside, he recognized the courage it took to speak such truths to a stranger. When she finished, he simply nodded and rose to clear the dishes. Later, as the night drew in, Russell pulled on his coat. "I lay fresh straw in the barn," he said. "If you'd prefer privacy, you can sleep there. It's warm enough with blankets." But Sarah shook her head. "The spare cot by the hearth will do fine, if you don't mind." Her hands clutched her Bible closer. "I've had enough of barns and way stations." Russell retired to his small bedroom, leaving Sarah to settle on the cot. Through the thin wall, he heard her quiet movements as she prepared for bed, followed by the soft murmur of evening prayers. Morning came with the crow of his rooster. Russell pulled on his boots and headed out to milk the cows, feed the chickens, and tend to the morning chores. The familiar routine felt different somehow, knowing someone waited in the cabin. When he returned, the scent of fresh biscuits filled the air. Sarah stood at the stove, her hair neatly tucked under a clean bonnet, her apron already dusted with flour. She'd somehow found time to sweep the floor and lay a fresh cloth on the table. "Breakfast is nearly ready," she said, not turning from her work. Her voice held more confidence in the morning light, as if the new day had granted her a measure of peace. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the window, Russell saw the Miller brothers riding past, their pace deliberately, slow as they studied his cabin. Sarah quickly stepped back from the window, her shoulders tense. More riders passed throughout the morning, far more than usual for a quiet stretch of road. Each time, Sarah would shrink away from view, her face flushed with embarrassment. Russell noticed how she kept to the shadows when neighbors were near. As if trying to make herself invisible, something protective stirred in his chest as he watched her endure the scrutiny. He recognized the look in his neighbor's eyes, the same mix of curiosity and judgment he'd seen when his own wife first arrived from another settlement. But this was different. Sarah carried not just her own reputation, but the visible evidence of her past and her growing child. Russell found himself standing straighter when the next wagon passed, deliberately positioning himself in the doorway. He didn't wave or call out as he normally would have. His presence was message enough. This was his property, and those under his roof deserved respect. Inside, Sarah continued her work, her hands steady even as her cheeks burned with shame. She moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, transforming the bachelor's sparse home with small touches, a swept hearth, folded linens, herbs hanging to dry. The rhythm of Russell's solitary life began to shift, though he scarcely allowed himself to notice. Sunday morning arrived with golden light, streaming through the cabin windows. The autumn air held a sharp edge that made Sarah pull her shawl tighter as she stepped outside. Russell was already hitching the horse to his plain black buggy, his movements precise and practiced. "We'll be leaving for meeting soon," he said, adjusting the horse's harness. It wasn't a request but a statement, grounded in his Amish ways. Sarah's hands twisted in her shawl. Perhaps I should stay and tend to things here." Russell paused in his work, turning to face her. "The Sabbath is for worship," he said simply. Then, seeing the fear in her eyes, he added in a softer tone, "We'll sit in the back." The buggy wheels creaked as they rolled down the dusty road, town. Sarah sat rigid beside Russell, her worn Bible clutched tightly in her lap. With each turn of the wheels, her anxiety grew. The small meeting house came into view all too soon, its white-painted walls stark against the morning sky dot as they entered through the heavy wooden doors. A ripple of whispers swept through the gathered congregation. Sarah felt the weight of every stare, every turned head, every pointed glance at her swollen middle. Her fingers gripped her Bible until her knuckles whitened. True to his word, Russell led them to a back pew, positioning himself slightly forward. As if to shield her from the curious eyes, the minister took his place at the pulpit, his stern face surveying the congregation. His sermon thundered through the small space, words sharp as arrows. "The wages of sin cannot be hidden," he proclaimed, his voice rising. "Judgment falls upon the unrighteous." Each word seemed to strike Sarah like a physical blow. She kept her eyes fixed on her Bible, but the words swam before her tears. Besides her, Russell sat straight and still, his expression unreadable. The service stretched on endlessly, a torment of pointed scripture and meaningful glances. When the final hymn faded, several women approached them. Some offered stiff, proper smiles and curt nods. Others deliberately turned away, gathering their children close as if Sarah's presence might somehow taint them. The rejection was clear in every averted gaze and hurried departure. The return journey started in heavy silence. They were barely beyond the town limits when Sarah's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "I should never have come. I bring shame wherever I go." Russell pulled the horse to a stop, the buggy creaking to a halt on the quiet road. For a long moment he sat silent, hands resting on the reins. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "God sees more than gossip," he said, looking straight ahead. "More than what people choose to see." The words were few, but they carried the weight of deep conviction. The rest of the ride passed in silence. But something had shifted. Sarah's tears slowly dried in the crisp autumn air. When they reached the cabin, she disappeared inside while Russell tended to the horse. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, kneading dough with fierce concentration. The familiar motions of baking soothed her raw nerves. Soon, the cabin filled with the sweet aroma of cinnamon rolls rising in the oven. Russell settled in his chair by the hearth, his Bible open on his knee. As Sarah worked, his deep voice filled the cabin, reading from Psalms. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The words washed over Sarah as she removed the golden brown rolls from the oven. Her hands trembled less now as she arranged them on the cooling rack. The warmth of the hearth and the comfort of Scripture began to thaw the cold ache left by the way. Morning's judgment. Gradually her quiet sobs subsided. The tension in her shoulders eased as she sank into a chair, letting the peace of the evening settle around her. Here in the cabin sanctuary, far from the whispers and stares, she found a moment of rest. Russell continued reading, his steady voice an anchor in the gathering dusk, while the sweet rolls cooled on the counter and the hearth fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. 3 days passed in quiet routine at the cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Russell worked at mending a broken fence post. His skilled hands moved steadily, driving nails into fresh-cut wood. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and approaching winter. The sound of hoofbeats broke the morning stillness. Russell looked up to see a rider approaching, dust rising behind the horse's hooves. His grip tightened on the hammer as he recognized Reverend Creighton's tall form astride his bay stallion. The preacher reined his horse to a stop, looming over Russell. His stern face was set in hard lines, his black coat pristine despite the dusty ride. "Brother Yoder," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to discuss the matter of your house guest." Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway, drawn by the voices. Her face went pale as she recognized the preacher, and her hands moved protectively to her swollen belly. She stood frozen on the porch, gripping the rough-hewn post. "The woman needs correction," Reverend Creighton declared, his voice rising. "The town council agrees. She must return with me today." His horse stamped impatiently, sensing the tension in the air. Russell set down his hammer with deliberate care. Though unused to confrontation, he drew himself up to his full height. "No," he said simply, his voice quiet but firm. The preacher's face darkened. "You risk much, Yoder. Harboring her will bring ruin to your good name. The community won't stand for such impropriety." "She's under my roof," Russell stated, squaring his shoulders. Each word came slow and measured, heavy with purpose. "And she stays." Reverend Creighton's fingers tightened on his reins until his knuckles showed white. "This isn't finished," he warned, his voice hard as iron. "I'll return, and you'll answer to more than just me." He wheeled his horse around, spurring it perhaps harder than necessary. "The Lord sees all, Brother Yoder. Remember that." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake. Sarah's hands trembled as she retreated into the cabin. The morning's peace lay shattered around them like broken glass dot as evening approached. Savory smells filled the cabin. Sarah stood at the cook stove, stirring a pot of venison stew. Her movements were jerky, uncertain, her earlier confidence shaken by the preacher's visit. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the rich aroma of meat and herbs, but she barely seemed to notice. Russell came in from his evening chores, stamping dust from his boots. He watched Sarah's trembling hands for a moment before speaking. "A house with fire and food is no sin," he said quietly, his words filling the tense space between them. Sarah's stirring slowed, though her shoulders remained tight. "The Reverend doesn't see it that way," she whispered. "The Reverend ain't God," Russell replied, his plain words carrying the weight of conviction. They ate their supper in companionable silence. the stew warming their bellies if not their worried minds. The tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, marking time like a countdown to some unseen future. After the dishes were cleared, Russell pulled on his coat. "Need to see to the mule," he said, heading for the door. But his steps were heavy with more than just weariness in the barn. As he spread fresh hay for the animal, doubt crept in like evening shadows. Had he stepped outside God's order by defying the preacher? His Amish upbringing had taught him to respect authority, to keep to the straight and narrow path. Yet something deeper than tradition had moved him to stand firm today. Back in the cabin, Sarah sat close to the hearth, her Bible open on her lap. Her lips moved in silent prayer as she read familiar verses, seeking courage in ancient words. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks, but her voice grew stronger as she whispered, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." No evil. The household settled into an uneasy vigilance. Each passing rider caused them to tense. Every distant hoofbeat brought fresh anxiety. Yet in their shared defiance of the preacher's demands, something new was taking root. Trust, born of standing together against judgment, grew stronger with each passing hour. While fear still lingered like morning mist, it could not quite overcome the warmth of their small sanctuary. The fire crackled in the hearth, the stew pot hung ready for tomorrow's meal, and two souls found unexpected strength in choosing mercy over judgment. Dark clouds rolled in from the mountains like a heavy wool blanket, bringing with them a sudden blast of winter. The first snowflakes fell thick and fast, coating the cabin windows in white lace. Inside, the fire crackled steadily as Sarah sat in the wooden rocking chair, her nimble fingers working to mend a tear in one of Russell's worn shirts. Russell sat across from her in his straight-back chair, his rough hands moving steadily as he whittled a piece of pine. Wood shavings curled at his feet like tiny waves. The only sounds were the whisper of thread through fabric, the soft scrape of his knife against wood, and the constant howl of wind outside. The storm showed no signs of letting up as evening approached. Sarah lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the growing darkness. Her eyes were tired from sewing in the dim light, but her fingers kept moving, guided by years of practice. On the second evening of their confinement, as shadows deepened and the storm raged on, Sarah began to hum softly. The tune grew stronger until words emerged, an old hymn her mother had taught her. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Her clear voice filled the cabin, rising above the wind's moan. Russell's hands stilled on his whittling, though his eyes remained fixed on the fire. The familiar melody seemed to soften something in the air between them. When the hymn ended, silence settled back like dust. Sarah's fingers twisted in her apron. "My mother sang that to me every night when I was small," she said quietly. "Before." She swallowed hard, "before everything changed." Russell set aside his whittling, waiting. "Thomas, my husband, he seemed so sure of everything when I met him," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said he could turn any hand of cards into a fortune. But the more he lost, the more he played, trying to win it back." Her hand moved to her swollen belly. "He died in a saloon fight over unpaid debts. Left me nothing but shame and this child to bear alone." The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind drove snow against the windows. With a sound like thrown sand after a long pause, Russell spoke, his voice rough with disuse. "Rebecca, my wife, she took fever 5 winters ago." His hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "Nothing I could do. Just watched her slip away, praying harder than I ever had." He drew a deep breath, left me hollow inside. "Been that way since." Sarah's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Russell nodded once, sharply. Words had never come easy to him, but something in the storm's enforced intimacy loosened his tongue. "Reckon we both know about being left behind." Through the night, the storm raged on. They sat in companionable silence, each lost in memories, but somehow less alone in their shared grief. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Sarah added another log, and sparks danced up like fireflies. When the third morning dawned, the storm had spent itself. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow that lay deep and unmarked around the cabin. Russell pulled on his heavy coat and boots, heading out to clear paths to the barn, and Sarah stood at the frosted window, watching him work. His strong arms lifted the snow shovel again and again, carving order from chaos. Gratitude welled up in her heart for this quiet man who had given her shelter when others would have turned her away. Yet fear lurked beneath, her thankfulness like a shadow under ice. The preacher's threats echoed in her mind. When the roads cleared, he would return, bringing judgment with him. Her hands pressed against the cold glass as she watched Russell work, wondering how long this refuge could last. The sound of his boots stomping snow on the porch made her step back from the window. She busied herself at the stove, setting water to boil for coffee. But her eyes strayed to the window again and again, watching the pristine white landscape that stretched to the horizon. The storm had granted them 2 days of peace, a chance to share the burdens they each carried alone. Yet as beautiful as the fresh snow looked in the morning sun, Sarah knew too well how quickly such beauty could turn treacherous. Like the snow, their temporary sanctuary might prove as fleeting as winter sunshine on ice. The morning sun melted patches of snow, turning the wagon road into a mess of mud and slush. Russell hitched the team, checking the harnesses with practiced hands. They needed supplies, flour, lamp oil, and other necessities that couldn't wait. Despite the treacherous roads, Sarah appeared on the porch, wrapped in her threadbare shawl. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. Russell paused in his work. "Town folk ain't kind." "I know," Sarah lifted her chin, "but I won't hide forever." He nodded once, respecting her courage. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, careful of her condition. The horses' hooves squelched in the mud as they set off, wagon wheels cutting deep ruts in the softening earth. The town came into view through the morning mist, a collection of wooden buildings lining the muddy main street. Sarah's shoulders tensed as they approached. Already, faces appeared in windows, watching. Russell pulled the wagon up in front of Hanson's general store. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, drawing every eye in the place. Sarah kept close to Russell's shoulder as he moved through the store, gathering their needed items. Mrs. Kettering stood by the dry goods counter, her sharp eyes taking in Sarah's swollen belly beneath her coat. She leaned close to Mrs. Miller, whispering loud enough to carry. Poor Russell Yoder paid for a housekeeper and got himself more than he bargained for. Sarah's cheeks flamed red. She busied herself examining a bolt of calico, trying to appear deaf to the cruel words. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Kettering continued, her voice rising. "That placement agent ought to be ashamed, sending damaged goods to decent folk." Russell set the sack of flour on the counter with deliberate care. His quiet voice cut through the whispers. "I'll take 2 pounds of coffee as well, Mr. Hanson." The storekeeper hurried to fill the order. Uncomfortable with the tension in his shop, Mrs. Kettering sniffed loudly and moved closer, her silk skirts rustling. "Really, Mr. Yoder," she said, "I know several respectable widows who'd be happy to keep house for you. There's no need to settle for." Her eyes raked over Sarah with disdain. Russell counted out coins carefully. "Much obliged for your concern, Mrs. Kettering." His tone was level, but his jaw was set. "Sarah tends my home right fine." He gathered their purchases, nodding to Mr. Hanson. Sarah followed him out, her head high despite the tears threatening to fall. On the boardwalk, away from prying eyes, her composure cracked. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Without hesitation, Russell offered his arm, a public gesture that spoke volumes in their small town. Sarah gripped it like a lifeline. as they walked to the wagon. "Let them watch," his stance seemed to say. Let them see he stood beside her. The ride home was quiet, broken only by the creak of harness leather and the horse's steady hoofbeats. Sarah stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-patched fields as they approached the cabin. Inside, Sarah attacked the bread dough with fierce energy, kneading it harder than necessary. Her fingers worked the soft mass again and again, trying to pound out her anger and hurt. Flour dusted her apron, her cheeks still flushed from more than just exertion. Russell sat at the kitchen table, watching her work. After a while, he spoke. Softly, "A loaf rises slow, same as trust." Sarah's hands stilled in the dough. She looked up, meeting his steady gaze. Understanding passed between them. He would stand by her, whatever came. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. They ate their evening meal quietly, but the silence held comfort now instead of awkwardness. The lamp cast a warm glow over the table as they shared fresh bread and stew. Sarah felt the weight of the day's confrontation lifting slightly. For the first time since coming to Russell's home, she felt truly defended, not just sheltered, but protected. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and stars began to appear in the clear evening air. Inside the cabin, two wounded souls found a measure of peace in shared bread and quiet understanding. Something had shifted between them, as subtle but significant as the changing of seasons. Russell bowed his head for evening prayers, his voice low and steady. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the familiar words. In that moment, she wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. 3 days after the incident at the general store, Sarah stood by the window, washing breakfast dishes when she spotted Mrs. Bradford's wagon approaching. Her hands stilled in the soapy water, anxiety tightening her chest. The older woman had always been kind, if distant. During church services the wagon pulled up, and Mrs. Bradford climbed down, smoothing her dark blue skirts. Sarah dried her hands quickly on her apron as Russell went out to greet their visitor. "Good morning, Mr. Yoder," Mrs. Bradford called. "I've come to invite Sarah to our quilting circle today. We're meeting at the Peterson place." Sarah appeared. In the doorway, uncertainty written across her face, Mrs. Bradford smiled warmly. "We could use your help with a wedding quilt, dear. Several of us noticed your fine stitching on your shawl at church." Russell turned to Sarah, his expression encouraging. "You should go," he said quietly. "Do you good to spend time with the women folk." Sarah twisted her apron in her hands. I don't want to cause any trouble." "Nonsense," Mrs. Bradford said firmly. "Martha Peterson specifically asked me to fetch you. Come along now. Bring whatever scraps you have for the pattern." After gathering her sewing basket and a few precious fabric pieces, Sarah climbed into the wagon. She glanced back at Russell, who nodded reassuringly before turning to his chores. The Peterson farmhouse bustled with activity when they arrived. 8 women sat around a large quilting frame in the front room, their needles flashing in the morning light. Some faces turned cold when Sarah entered, but Martha Peterson welcomed her warmly. "Come sit by me, Sarah." Martha patted the empty chair beside her. "We're working on a double wedding ring pattern for my niece." Sarah settled in, threading her needle with practiced ease. The familiar motion calmed her nerves as the women's chatter washed over her. Mrs. Kettering and her friends huddled at the far end of the frame, whispering behind their hands. As she worked, Sarah recalled a verse that often brought her comfort. Softly she recited, "She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands." Martha smiled. Proverbs 31, my mother's favorite. "Mine too," Sarah replied, carefully placing the stitch. "She taught me that a woman's hands should never be idle." Other women nodded in agreement. Soon, they were sharing favorite scripture passages while they worked. Sarah's sure stitches drew admiring glances, even from those who had been standoffish at first. By mid-afternoon, The tension in the room had eased considerably. Mrs. Wilson, studying Sarah's neat rows of stitching, spoke up. "Those are the finest stitches I've seen since my grandmother passed. Where did you learn such fine work?" Sarah explained how her mother had taught her to quilt during long winter evenings. Her voice grew stronger as she described the intricate patterns they had created together. "Well," said Mrs. Wilson, setting down her needle, "you'll need help. When your time comes, I'd be happy to assist if you'll have me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I would be most grateful," she whispered. The afternoon light was fading when Mrs. Bradford drove Sarah home. Her sewing basket now contained several bright fabric squares, gifts from Martha and others who had extra pieces to share. The simple generosity touched Sarah deeply. Russell looked up from feeding the chickens as the wagon approached. He noticed immediately how Sarah's face glowed with happiness. Despite her obvious tiredness out after thanking Mrs. Bradford, Sarah hurried inside to show Russell her gifted treasures. She spread the fabric squares on the kitchen table, touching each one reverently. "Martha Peterson says these blues will make a fine baby blanket," she said, her voice trembling with joy. Russell bowed his head briefly, offering silent thanks for this small mercy. The sight of Sarah's happiness stirred something in his heart he had thought long buried over their evening meal of beans and cornbread. Sarah described the day. "Some still won't look at me," she admitted. "But others, they treated me like I belonged." She paused, arranging her words carefully. "Mrs. Wilson offered to help when the baby comes." Russell nodded, understanding the significance of this gesture. "The Lord provides," he said simply. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the table. "I never thought I'd find acceptance here. When I first arrived," she trailed off, looking around the cabin that had become her refuge. Russell watched her, suddenly aware that Sarah had become more than just someone under his protection. Her presence had transformed his lonely house into a true home, filled with warmth and purpose. The change had come so gradually he had scarcely noticed it happening. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. The new fabric squares, lying bright and full of promise on Sarah's sewing basket nearby. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Russell's property as he split the last pieces of wood. His arms ached from the day's labor, but satisfaction warmed him as he gazed at the neat pile ready for winter. The familiar rhythm of chopping had settled his thoughts, though they kept drifting back to the woman who now shared his home. Sweet wood smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, carrying with it the promise of a hot meal. Russell gathered an armload of split logs and headed inside, the screen door creaking softly as he entered. The sight that greeted him made him pause. Sarah stood at the stove, her hair neatly tucked beneath her cap, stirring a pot that filled the cabin with rich, savory aromas. Fresh bread cooled on the windowsill, golden brown and perfect. "I hope you're hungry," Sarah said, glancing over her shoulder. "The chicken stew's been simmering all afternoon." Russell set the wood in the box by the hearth. "Smells mighty fine," he replied, washing his hands in the basin. The fire's warmth reached into every corner of the room, making the cabin feel snug. Against the cooling evening air, Sarah ladled the stew into bowls while Russell moved 2 chairs closer to the fireplace. They had taken to eating there on cooler evenings, the crackling flames providing both warmth and gentle light. "The wheat's coming along well," Russell said, breaking off a piece of warm bread. "Should have a good harvest, Lord willing." Sarah nodded, blowing gently on her spoonful of stew. "I noticed new shoots in the kitchen garden today. Those peas we planted are strong." "Weather's been kind," Russell observed, "though we could use more rain soon." "The baby's been active today," Sarah shared, her hand resting briefly on her growing belly, "especially when I was kneading bread." Something about the ordinary nature of their conversation, the simple sharing of daily concerns, touched them both. Sarah's soft laugh surprised them as she added, "I think this little one's going to be a baker." The sound of her laughter, so unexpected and light, startled Russell. Then, to his own surprise, he found himself chuckling too. The moment stretched between them, warm and genuine. After they finished eating, Russell reached for his Bible, worn smooth with years of handling. He settled back in his chair, the firelight making it easier to see the pages. His finger traced along the lines as he read from Psalms, his voice low and steady. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pa." He paused, stumbling over pastures. "Pastures," Sarah supplied gently, smiling. Her correction held no judgment, only warmth. Russell nodded gratefully and continued reading, his voice growing more confident. The familiar words filled the cabin, mingling with the pop and crackle of the fire. Sarah's hand stayed busy with her mending, but her face showed she was listening intently. When he finished the chapter, they sat in comfortable silence. The peace settling over them felt different from the quiet of previous evenings. It felt like family. Rising to clear the table, Sarah stacked the empty bowls carefully. "I want to thank you," she said softly, her back to Russell as she worked, "for giving me shelter when others wouldn't." Russell stood too, gathering the spoons and cups. He considered her words carefully before responding, as was his way. "It's no charity," he finally said, his voice gruff but kind. "It's grace." Sarah's hands stilled on the dishcloth. She turned slightly, and in the firelight, Russell could see tears shining in her eyes, though she smiled. Moving to the rocking chair near the hearth, Sarah lowered herself carefully. Her hand came to rest on her rounded belly, and her voice was barely above a whisper as she spoke. "There's hope for us here, little one. Real hope." Russell busied himself banking the fire for the night, but his heart felt full in a way it hadn't for years. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now held something precious, the possibility of family, built not on obligation, but on grace freely given and gratefully received. The autumn days settled into a peaceful rhythm at Russell's homestead. Sarah's cooking filled the cabin with warmth each morning and evening, while Russell tended to the endless tasks that frontier life demanded. Their quiet companionship grew stronger with each passing day, built on small kindnesses and shared work. One crisp morning, as Sarah kneaded dough for the day's bread, the thunder of approaching hooves shattered their peace. Russell looked up from mending his boot at the kitchen table, his face tightening as he recognized Reverend Creighton's tall bay. Horse. 2 more riders flanked him, the church deacons, their dark coats severe against the morning light. Sarah's hands stilled in the dough, flour dusting her apron. Her eyes met Russell's, wide with fear. "Stay inside," Russell said quietly, rising from his chair. The floorboards creaked under his steady stride as he moved to the door. The riders dismounted, their boots raising small clouds of dust in the yard. Reverend Creighton's face was stern as granite as he approached, Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. "Brother Yoder," the preacher's voice carried sharp across the yard, "we've come for the woman." Russell planted himself in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His voice came calm but firm. "She is safe here." "Safe?" Creighton's laugh held no mirth. "She lives in sin under your roof, unmarried and with child. The town talks of nothing else. We've come to place her where she can receive proper correction." Behind Russell, Sarah's soft footsteps approached. She appeared at his shoulder, her own Bible held close to her heart like a shield. Though her hands trembled, she stood straight. The deacons shifted uncomfortably, but Reverend Creighton's face darkened. "This is rebellion, Brother Yoder, against the church and against God's own order. Step aside." "No," Russell's voice remained steady. "God's order includes mercy." "You risk everything," Creighton warned, stepping closer. "You're standing in the community, your church membership, even your soul. Is this woman worth excommunication?" Sarah gasped softly, but Russell didn't move. "A man answers to God before men," he said simply, The morning wind stirred the dust between them as they stood locked in silent confrontation. The deacons glanced at each other nervously, unused to seeing anyone stand against their preacher. Reverend Creighton's fingers whitened around his Bible. "This isn't finished. The town council will hear of this. They won't stand for such impropriety in their midst." He turned sharply, his coat snapping in the wind. "Mount up," he ordered the deacons. They watched as the three men rode away, dust settling in their wake. Only when the riders disappeared beyond the rise did Russell's shoulders relax slightly. Sarah's legs weakened, and she sank into the porch chair, her Bible dropping into her lap. "Oh, Russell," she whispered, "what have I brought upon you?" "Your church, your community." Russell turned to face her, his eyes gentle despite the morning's tension. "The church is more than one man's judgment," he said quietly. "And community means standing together when it matters most." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "But everything you've built here, your reputation, your place among your people, those things matter less than doing what's right." Russell's voice held certainty. "A roof without kindness ain't worth having." They spent the rest of the morning in quiet industry, Sarah returning to her bread-making, Russell to his chores. But something had shifted between them, deepening like a river after rain. Their shared defiance against Creighton had forged a stronger bond, though fear of what might come still hung in the air, like storm clouds on the horizon. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah's hands were restless with worry as she mended a shirt. "The town council," she said softly. "What will they do?" Russell looked up from his Bible. "We'll face that when it comes. Together." "Together," Sarah repeated, the word carrying both comfort and concern. She rested one hand on her growing belly, protecting the life within. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney into the darkening sky. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the prairie, but inside the cabin, two souls found strength in their shared stand against judgment. Though tomorrow might bring new challenges, tonight they had chosen mercy over fear, grace over law. It was enough. Heavy snow blanketed the Colorado homestead, turning the world white and silent. Inside the cabin, Russell studied their dwindling food stores with growing concern. The flour barrel showed bottom, and their preserved vegetables wouldn't last through winter's grip. His gaze settled on the fat hog in the pen, a decision he'd hoped to delay. "We'll need to butcher today," he announced quietly over breakfast. "The cold's good for meat preservation." Sarah nodded, understanding the necessity. Though her advancing pregnancy made movement harder, she insisted on helping. "I know how to salt meat," she said. "My mother taught me." The morning air bit sharp as Russell led the hog to slaughter. He worked quickly, respectfully, while Sarah prepared the salting barrels. By midday, fresh cuts hung in the cold shed, and they began the careful work of preservation. Sarah's skilled hands moved steadily through the task, though more slowly than before. Her belly had grown round enough to make bending difficult. Still, she worked alongside Russell, showing him the proper way to pack the meat with salt and spices. "Like this," she demonstrated, "so it cures even." Her fingers trembled slightly from cold and fatigue, but her movements remained precise. As evening approached, they gathered for prayers by the fire. Russell's voice carried soft through the familiar words when Sarah suddenly gasped, clutching her side. His prayer stopped mid-sentence. "Sarah?" Fear edged his voice. She breathed deeply, face pale. "Just a pain. It's passing now." But Russell saw how she cradled her belly, protective and worried. "You've worked too hard today," he said, helping her to her chair. "The babe moves more lately," she admitted. "But it's not time yet." That night, Russell lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside and Sarah's breathing across the room. When morning came, he decided to ride to town for medicine, despite the bitter cold. "It's too dangerous," Sarah protested, watching him bundle in extra layers. "We need supplies," he insisted. "And something for pain, if it comes again." The ride into town was brutal. Wind cut through his heaviest coat, and ice formed on his horse's mane. By the time he reached the general store, his fingers had lost feeling inside. He stomped snow from his boots, nodding to the handful of men gathered around the potbelly stove. Their conversation hushed as he approached the counter, but fragments reached his ears. "That woman living out at Yoder's place. Council meets next week. Can't have such goings-on. Might need to take matters in hand." Russell's jaw tightened as he collected his purchases: medicine, sugar, coffee, and lamp oil. The threats weren't subtle, but winter's grip might buy them time. The return journey proved even harder. Darkness fell early, and his horse struggled through deepening drifts. By the time the cabin's lamp appeared through the gloom, his face and hands had gone numb with cold. Sarah stood in the doorway, worry etched on her face. She helped him inside, where soup simmered on the stove. "I've been watching since sunset," she said, helping him remove his frozen coat. His fingers were too stiff to manage buttons. Sarah tended him carefully, wrapping his hands in warm cloths and pressing a cup of hot broth into them once feeling returned. They sat close to the fire, its warmth slowly thawing the day's chill. Sarah noticed his troubled expression. "What did you hear in town?" Russell considered softening the truth, but knew she deserved honesty. "Talk of the council meeting. Some want to force you out." Sarah's hands tightened around her cup. "Even in winter? Even then. But I won't let it happen." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the fire's snap and pop. Finally, Sarah spoke softly. "I haven't felt safe since Thomas died. Not until here." She met his eyes. "Not until you." The simple truth of her words filled the cabin. Russell watched the firelight play across her face, seeing not the scandal others claimed, but a woman of quiet courage. He thought of the townsfolk's threats, of the council's coming judgment, of the long winter ahead. "Safety's not just walls and warmth," he said carefully. "It's knowing someone stands with you." Sarah nodded, one hand resting on her belly. Outside, the wind moaned across the prairie, but inside their cabin, trust had deepened like winter snow. And fear held no power against it. The snow showed no signs of retreating as February stretched on. Inside the warm cabin, Sarah sat by the hearth, carefully piecing together squares of fabric from her quilting circle gifts. Her needle flashed in the firelight, creating tiny, even stitches that would keep a small one warm. Russell paused in his, whittling to watch her work. The way her hands moved, sure and gentle, reminded him of birds in flight. She hummed softly as she sewed, a hymn tune that had become familiar to his ears over these winter months. "How do you make them so straight?" he asked, setting aside his knife. Sarah looked up, surprised by his interest. "Would you like to learn?" Russell hesitated, then nodded. Sarah shifted on the bench, making room beside her. She handed him a needle already threaded and 2 small squares of fabric. "Hold them like this," she demonstrated, placing the pieces right sides together. "Then start at the corner, small stitches, each the same size." His large hands, accustomed to axe handles and plow reins, fumbled with the delicate needle. The first few stitches wandered like a drunken fence line. Sarah bit her lip, trying not to laugh. "I reckon I should stick to carpentry," Russell said. But his eyes held a glimmer of amusement. No, Sarah encouraged, steadying his hand. "Just imagine you're drawing a straight line, but with thread instead of pencil." They sat shoulder to shoulder as she guided him through the basic steps. Her pregnancy made it awkward to lean too close, but she managed to demonstrate the proper technique. The warmth of the fire and their shared concentration filled the cabin with comfortable silence. "My mother taught me to quilt when I was 8 years old," Sarah said softly. "Said every stitch was a prayer for the one who'd sleep under it." Her hand rested briefly on her rounded belly. I never thought I'd be making one for my own child." Russell's next stitch went crooked as he absorbed her words. He had watched her belly grow through the winter months, but this was the first time she had spoken so directly of the coming baby. "There," Sarah said, examining his work. "You're improving already." A genuine laugh escaped her as she held up his attempts, one side neat and straight where she had guided him, the other wandering like a creek bed. The sound of her laughter, rare and precious, filled the cabin with unexpected joy. To both their surprise, it became their evening ritual. After supper dishes were cleared and prayers said, they would sit together by the fire, working on the quilt. Sarah's skilled hands created intricate patterns, while Russell mastered simple straight seams. His stitches gradually became more even, though they never matched her precision. One evening, Russell returned from a supply run to town, stamping snow from his boots. Along with the usual flour and coffee, he pulled something else from his coat, a carefully wrapped bundle. "What's this?" Sarah asked as he placed it in her lap. "Open it," he said quietly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unwrapped the paper. Inside lay several yards of soft blue calico, the color of spring skies. Sarah touched it reverently, then burst into tears. Russell stood awkward and concerned, until he realized they were tears of joy. The fabric pooled in her lap like water as she ran her hands over it again and again. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But you shouldn't have spent your money." "It's for the little one," Russell said simply. He carefully smoothed a corner of the fabric that had crumpled. "Every baby needs something new, not just scraps." Sarah looked up at him through her tears. Perhaps God did have a purpose in sending me here." When the placement agent made his mistake— "No mistake," Russell interrupted gently. "God's hand moves in ways we don't always understand." He laid the blue calico across her lap with careful reverence, as if arranging an altar cloth. The color brought out answering brightness in Sarah's eyes, and for a moment, the cabin seemed filled with spring promise despite winter's grip outside. Sarah touched the fabric once more, then reached for Russell's hand. "Would you help me cut the squares for this section? I'll show you how to measure them proper." Together they worked in the lamplight, measuring and cutting the new fabric to join the growing quilt. Their hands met occasionally over the scissors or pins, no longer awkward, but comfortable in their shared purpose. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, hope was being stitched together one careful seam at a time. The late winter wind rattled the cabin windows like angry fists. Sarah sat at the table, her face twisted in sudden pain. The spoon she held clattered to the floor, soup splashing across worn planks. "Russell," she gasped. "The baby, it's too early." Russell sprang from his chair, knocking it backwards. His hands shook as he helped Sarah to the bed. Another pain gripped her, and she clutched her swollen belly, face white with fear. "What do I do?" Russell paced between the bed and hearth, his boots marking desperate paths. "The midwife in town, she's too far in this storm." Sarah's cry pierced the air again. Russell's mind raced, then settled on a memory. The Navajo woman, Naya, who lived in the valley below. She had offered help months ago when she saw Sarah's condition, though he had gruffly refused. Pride meant nothing now. "Hold on," he told Sarah, squeezing her hand. "I know where to find help." He grabbed his heaviest coat and ran to the barn. The wind howled as he saddled his most sure-footed horse. Snow stung his face like needles as he rode into the storm, following the path down to Naya's small house. The horse struggled through drifts, steam rising from its flanks. Lamplight glowed in Naya's window. She opened her door before he could knock, as if expecting him. "The baby comes," he said, words nearly lost in the wind. Naya nodded once, gathering her medicine bag and wrapping herself in a thick blanket. Without hesitation, she mounted behind him on the horse. They rode back through the deepening snow, Naya's calm presence steadying them both. Inside the cabin, Sarah lay writhing on the bed. Mia moved to her side, speaking soft words of comfort. She pulled herbs and supplies from her bag, setting them on the table with practiced efficiency. "Boil water," she instructed Russell. "Many clean cloths." Hours crawled by like years. Sarah's cries filled the small space as labor pains gripped her. Russell paced, prayed, and brought whatever Naya requested. The native woman remained steady as a mountain, murmuring encouragement in both English and her own tongue. "The baby turns wrong," Naya said late in the night, her hands gentle on Sarah's belly. She began burning sage, its sharp scent filling the air. Her skilled fingers worked to adjust the infant's position while Sarah whimpered. Russell dropped to his knees beside the bed, clasping Sarah's hand. "Lord above, spare them both," he whispered over and over. Sarah's fingers tightened on his with. Each wave of pain. The storm raged outside, but inside time seemed to stop. Naya worked tirelessly, her movements sure and practiced. She sang softly healing songs passed down through generations. Though Russell didn't understand the words, their power filled the room as false dawn began to gray the windows. Sarah's cries changed. "Now," Naya said. "The baby comes now." Russell held Sarah's shoulders as she pushed. Sweat soaked her hair, her face contorted with effort. Finally, a new cry pierced the air, thin but determined. "A girl," Naya announced, cleaning and wrapping the tiny infant. "Small, but she fights like a warrior." Tears streamed openly down Russell's weathered cheeks as Naya placed the baby in Sarah's arms. The infant was indeed small, but her cry was strong. Her face was red and wrinkled, perfect as a new day. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, looking from the baby to Naya. "I don't deserve such kindness." "Life is for everyone," Naya replied simply. She gathered her supplies, leaving herbs for tea and healing. "I will return tomorrow to check on you both." Russell grabbed Naya's hand as she turned to leave. Words failed him, but she seemed to understand. She squeezed his hand once, then slipped out into the lightning dawn. Returning to the bed, Russell sat beside Sarah, one hand holding hers while the other touched the baby's downy head. The storm was passing, and morning light began to filter through the windows. Sarah's eyes were tired but shining as she looked at him. "Grace," she said softly. "That's what we'll call her, because that's what brought her safely here." Russell nodded, too moved to speak. Together they watched their daughter's tiny face, marveling at each perfect feature. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the new snow with gold. Inside, 3 hearts beat in harmony, a family forged by mercy, delivered by grace. Words spread through town as quick as winter lightning. By midday, hoofbeats echoed down the snowy road to Russell's cabin. Reverend Creighton led the way, his black coat stark against the fresh white snow. Behind him rode several townsfolk, their faces set with righteous purpose. Inside the cabin, Sarah rested in bed while Naya gently rocked the newborn Grace. The native woman's skilled hands cradled the infant with practiced care, humming a soft melody passed down through generations. Russell stood near the window, watching the approaching riders with squared shoulders. The cabin door burst open, letting in a blast of cold air. Reverend Creighton strode in, his mouth already open to deliver judgment. But the sight before him made his steps falter. There stood Naya, dignified and calm, holding the tiny bundle. Grace's small face peeked out from the blankets, peaceful in sleep. Russell moved protectively closer to Sarah's bedside. The Reverend's prepared condemnation died on his lips. The townsfolk crowding behind him fell silent, taking in the scene: the exhausted but glowing mother, the steadfast farmer, the native midwife who had saved both mother and child. "This," Reverend Creighton started, then stopped, his certainty crumbling before the simple tableau of mercy. Russell's voice filled the quiet cabin, steady and clear. "God's grace is in this house. No man can take it away." The words hung in the air like truth itself. Naya continued her gentle rocking, her quiet dignity a rebuke to their judgment. Some of the townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, gazes dropping to the floor. They had come expecting to find sin and scandal, but instead discovered something holy. Mrs. Kettering, who had been so quick to gossip, stepped forward to peer at the baby. Her face softened at Grace's tiny features. "She's beautiful," she whispered, almost against her will. Reverend Creighton looked from face to face, from Sarah's tired eyes to Russell's firm stance, from Nia's skilled hands to the peaceful infant. His rigid certainty seemed to crack like river ice in spring. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The townsfolk followed, murmuring among themselves. Their voices carried notes of wonder rather than condemnation now. After they had gone, Sarah reached for Russell's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, tears gleaming in her eyes. "For everything." Russell squeezed her fingers gently, watching as Naya placed Grace back in her mother's arms. The morning sun streamed through the windows, touching each face with golden light. In that moment, the cabin felt like sacred ground, blessed not by judgment, but by mercy, not by law, but by love. The native woman smiled softly, gathering her healing herbs. She had done more than deliver a child. She had helped deliver understanding to hearts long closed by fear and pride. As she prepared to leave, Sarah reached out to catch her hand. "Stay," Sarah said quietly. "Share our bread." Naya nodded, settling back into her chair. Outside, the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into silence, leaving only peace behind. The last patches of snow melted under the strengthening March sun, releasing winter's grip on the land. Early morning light spilled across the cabin's wooden porch where Russell, Sarah, and baby Miriam sat together in peaceful contentment. The child, now 3 months old, cooed softly in her mother's arms, while Russell gently rocked in his chair, the wood creaking in familiar rhythm. Sarah breathed in the fresh spring air, watching as new grass pushed through the thawing earth. Her shoulders, once hunched with shame, now held the straight posture of a woman who had found her place. The morning breeze carried the scent of damp earth and promise. "Looks like the Petersons coming up the road," Russell noted, squinting at the approaching wagon. Sarah nodded, no longer tensing at the sight of visitors. In recent weeks, neighbors had begun stopping by with increasing frequency, bearing small gifts and tentative friendship. Mrs. Peterson climbed down from the wagon, carrying a covered dish that steamed in the cool morning air. "Brought you some fresh bread," she called out, climbing the porch steps. "And there's apple preserves, too." Her eyes softened as she gazed at little Miriam, reaching out to touch one tiny hand. "Much obliged," Sarah said, her voice steady and sure. The words of gratitude came easier now, weighted with dignity instead of desperate thanks. Throughout the week, more neighbors appeared. The Miller family brought early spring vegetables from their cold frames. Even Mrs. Kettering, who had once been quick to judge, arrived with a hand-sewn blanket for the baby. When Sunday arrived, Russell dressed with particular care in his best black coat. Sarah helped him straighten his collar, sensing something important in his manner. They rode to the meeting house in the buggy, Miriam bundled snugly between them. The morning service proceeded as usual, with hymns rising to the simple wooden rafters. But when Reverend Creighton finished his sermon, Russell stood. A hush fell over the congregation as he made his way to the front, his steps measured and deliberate. Turning to face the gathered faithful, Russell spoke in his plain way, each word clear and strong. "I stand before God and this community to declare what He has already blessed. Sarah and Miriam are my family now, not by paper or ceremony, but by grace and choice." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she held Miriam close. The baby reached up, touching her mother's cheek with perfect trust. In the pews, heads nodded. Some smiled. Others wiped away tears of their own. After the service, People gathered around them, offering congratulations and welcome. The transformation was complete, from whispers of scandal to embraces of acceptance. Sarah stood tall beside Russell, her child secure in her arms, receiving their neighbors' good wishes with quiet joy. That evening, as darkness settled over the land, lamplight glowed warm through the cabin windows. Inside, Russell sat in his chair, by the fire, rocking Miriam gently. The baby's eyes were heavy with sleep. Her tiny fingers curled around his rough thumb. Sarah moved about the kitchen, humming an old hymn as she prepared their evening meal. The familiar tune filled the cabin with peace. "Amazing grace," she sang softly. "How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Russell watched her in the golden light, remembering that first evening months ago when she had stepped down from the wagon, alone and afraid. Now she moved with certainty, at home in this place that had become truly hers. The kettle sang on the stove, and Sarah poured tea into 3 cups, 1 for each of them, and a third for Naya, who still visited regularly. The native woman's friendship had become as much a part of their family as the daily rhythms of farm life. Miriam made a small sound in her sleep, and Russell adjusted the blanket around her. Sarah paused in her work to watch them, her heart full. The cabin glowed with warmth, love, and peace, everything she had once thought forever lost to her. Outside, early spring peepers began their evening chorus, singing of new beginnings. Inside, the small family remained together in contented silence, bound not by judgment or law, but by the strongest ties of all, mercy, grace, and chosen love. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.